Welcome, everyone. I want to start by saying that today's story isn't one I ever thought I would share. It's personal, it's raw, and honestly, it's something I never imagined talking about publicly. But as I sit here, I realize that sometimes the most painful experiences are the ones that hold the greatest lessons. And while this is a chapter of my life I never planned to open to the world, I know now that sharing it may help others in ways I never expected. And what I'm about to tell you is a secret, a part of my life that's been buried under layers of time and emotions. It's a story of family, trust, and the tough choices that come when secrets are finally revealed. You might find parts of yourself in this, or you might be reminded of a time when your own world was shaken by something unexpected. I'm not telling this story to gain sympathy or to point fingers. I'm sharing it because, in the end, it taught me something valuable. No matter how hard it is, facing the truth is the first step towards healing. And sometimes, we don't have the luxury of keeping the truth locked away forever. It was just another quiet afternoon, the kind of ordinary day you don't think twice about. I was in the bathroom, the door closed behind me, just trying to have a few minutes to myself. My mind was focused on the mundane, the sound of the water running, the steam gathering on the mirror, a typical break from the busyness of life. Then it happened, a knock. At first I didn't think much of it, maybe it was my husband or even my daughter needing something. But no one was supposed to be home. The house was empty, or at least that's what I thought. My heart skipped a beat, though, because the knock wasn't just a light tap. It was urgent, sharp, as though whoever was on the other side needed me, but didn't know how to ask. I stood there, frozen for a second, the sound of my own heartbeat suddenly loud in my ears. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, but it cracked in ways I couldn't control. The knocking stopped for a moment, followed by a muffled voice. It was unfamiliar, but it sounded close, almost too close. "Open the door, please." It was Jason, my stepson, the one I hadn't seen in months. He'd come back to stay with us a few weeks ago, but we'd barely spoken. Something had shifted between us, a distance that had grown over the years. I didn't know what had changed. He didn't seem like the same person anymore. And yet, there he was, standing outside the bathroom door, sounding desperate, like someone who needed help, but didn't know how to ask. I swallowed, trying to steady myself. "Jason, what are you doing here?" The question left my lips before I could think it through. When I opened the door, I saw him standing there, his face pale, eyes wide. He was older now, more distant somehow, but there was something different about him. Something in his expression, something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. It was the kind of look that made you wonder if the person standing in front of you was someone you'd known at all. I felt my throat tighten, my stomach turned. I need to talk to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He stood there, unsure of what to say, like every word was heavier than the last. I looked at him, searching for some hint of what was going on. Jason had always been difficult to read, a boy I'd known since he was young, but never really understood. He'd been quiet, reserved, kept to himself. I'd tried to reach out, but over time I learned to accept that we just didn't connect the way I hoped we would. But now, standing there in front of me, he was different. His face was tense, his hands trembling slightly, and I had this sinking feeling that whatever was coming next, it would be something I wasn't ready to hear. "What is it, Jason?" I asked, trying to stay calm, though my pulse was racing. I wanted to ask 1,000 things, but I kept my voice steady, my emotions in check. The air between us felt thick with anticipation, as if the moment was already too big for either of us to handle. He opened his mouth, but no words came out right away. Instead, he just stood there, looking like he was weighing every thought that crossed his mind. Finally, he spoke, but his words hung in the air like a shadow, too heavy for me to ignore. "I've been hiding something," he said, his eyes not meeting mine, "something I've kept from everyone. And I think it's time you knew." My heart skipped and I felt a chill run through me. Whatever he was about to say, it wasn't going to be easy. I could feel it deep in my gut. The moment had changed from something small and almost forgettable into something else entirely. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper now. "What have you been hiding?" Jason shifted his weight, looking uneasy, his hands clasped together in front of him. He took a deep breath, like he was about to step into unknown territory. And then he spoke the words that would forever change everything, words that I couldn't have prepared for, words that I didn't even know how to process. "I've been carrying a secret for so long," he started, his voice breaking slightly. "And it involves you and Dad. It's something I never meant to happen, but it did. And now it's too late to take back." The air seemed to freeze. The steam from the shower still hung thick in the air, but all I could focus on was him, my stepson, standing there, asking for something I didn't understand. His face was full of guilt, of fear, and yet I couldn't even begin to imagine what was coming next. I took a step back, my mind racing. "Jason, I need you to tell me exactly what's going on." He nodded, his expression clouded with uncertainty, and with that, I knew. I knew this moment would never let me go. It was the beginning of something I could never have prepared for. And as he finally spoke the words, I realized how little I truly knew about the people I'd let into my life. The knock had taken me by surprise. I had been alone in the house, just finishing up my shower, the quiet of the bathroom giving me a moment to breathe. My mind was wrapped up in 1,000 little things. Housework, the kids, my husband, when suddenly that sound cut through the stillness. Knock, knock, knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. My husband was at work, Jason was supposed to be out with friends, so who could it be? I stood still for a moment, the air growing thick with unease. I thought about calling out, but something made me stop, something in that knock, insistent, almost frantic, made my chest tighten. I pulled on my robe, feeling the weight of the moment without fully understanding why. As I stepped toward the door, my heart was already racing. When I opened it, I saw Jason standing there. But this wasn't the boy I'd known growing up. He was no longer the quiet child who would shuffle past me without saying much. Now he was taller, more adult, but there was something unsettling in the way he looked at me. His eyes weren't filled with anger, but there was a depth there, something that told me this wasn't going to be a casual chat. "Jason," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on? Why are you here?" His response was slow, like he was choosing each word carefully. I need to talk to you. There's something I can't keep inside anymore." It felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. My mind scrambled to make sense of what he was saying. "What is it?" I asked, feeling my pulse quicken. "I don't know how to say this," he mumbled, looking down for a moment. "I've been keeping something from you, and it's about Dad." Those words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I stepped back, instinctively trying to process what I was hearing. Jason never spoke about his father like that. My husband. Not in such a serious way, not like this. "About your dad?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice even, but inside I was already a few steps ahead, imagining the worst. Jason hesitated again before meeting my eyes. "It's complicated. I don't know how to explain it, but I need you to understand. It's been eating me up inside for so long." His words hung in the air between us, and I felt something tighten in my chest. My first thought was that this had to be something about their relationship, some unresolved tension that had built up over time. Maybe an argument, maybe something about their strained bond. But what he said next made everything freeze in place. "You don't know everything about what happened between me and Dad," Jason continued, his voice almost breaking. "I didn't want to tell you, but now I can't keep it from you anymore." I stood there, trying to make sense of his words. Every part of me was screaming to ask more, to dig deeper, but something held me back. It was as though whatever Jason was about to say would change everything. I knew I had to listen, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for the truth. Jason took a deep breath, and the silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. "I don't know if I can fix this, but I need to tell you. You deserve to know." I nodded slowly, trying to keep my composure. "What happened?" I asked, feeling a tightness in my throat. Jason finally let out a shaky breath and said, "It's about the way he treated me. About something that happened a long time ago. It's about why I couldn't stay. Why I left." The room seemed to shrink around me as I absorbed his words. Jason had always been a quiet person, but this was different. This wasn't the same troubled teen who had gone through phases of rebellion or anger. This was something far more complex, something that had haunted him for years. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I had no idea where this conversation was headed, but I had an unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach. Jason's voice lowered to almost a whisper. "I couldn't stay with him anymore. It wasn't just about the things you know. There's more to it. Something he did. Something I couldn't live with." I blinked, feeling the world shift beneath me. What are you saying?" My voice felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else. What did he do?" Jason shook his head slowly, his eyes clouded with guilt. "It's something I've carried with me. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how." There was a long pause as I waited for him to continue. Every second felt like it stretched on forever. "What happened?" I asked again, this time more urgently. His eyes were filled with emotion now. Pain, regret, maybe even shame. But it was the way he looked at me that stopped my heart. There was something raw and exposed in his gaze, something he hadn't shared with anyone before. "I don't know if you'll ever look at him the same way again," he said softly, "but you need to know. My dad, he did something to me. Something that changed everything." The words hit me harder than I could have ever prepared for. I took a step back, my mind racing but unable to grasp what Jason had just said. I wanted to say something, to scream, to ask him to explain, but all I could do was stand there, numb. This was the moment when everything I thought I knew about my family, about my husband, and even about Jason, shattered in a single instant. When I opened the door, I wasn't expecting Jason to be standing there. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of the usual awkwardness that hung between us. His face was different. His eyes were wide, but not in the way I remembered. The way a teenager looks when they're anxious or angry. No, this was something else. It was fear, raw and unfiltered. His gaze didn't waver, and it was as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. He didn't say hello or make any attempt to ease the tension. Instead, he looked straight at me, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "I need your help," he said, his words clipped, as if each one was a struggle to get out. I don't know who else to turn to. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I stood frozen. This wasn't the young man I remembered. Jason had always been quiet, reserved, a bit of a loner even. But this was different. He wasn't asking for advice or sharing some teenage dilemma. His face was pale, his expression frantic, like he was carrying something heavy, something he couldn't hold in any longer. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The air between us felt charged, thick with something I couldn't name. I finally found my voice. "Jason, what's going on? Why are you here?" But his eyes, wide and pleading, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a simple visit. There was a storm inside him, one I wasn't sure I was ready to weather. I don't know how to say this," Jason said, his voice low now, almost a whisper. "I can't carry this anymore. It's about, Dad, it's about what happened between us." The mention of my husband, his father, immediately shifted something inside me. My pulse quickened, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't the usual complaint about school, about life, or some other trivial thing. No, this was different, and I couldn't figure out why. I stepped back from the door, instinctively inviting him inside. "Come in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're scaring me. What happened between you two?" Jason hesitated, his hand hovering at the doorframe as though he was unsure whether to cross that line into the house, into the space where things had once felt safer. But he stepped in anyway, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he was carrying a weight much heavier than his own body. He didn't look at me, his eyes fixed on the floor as if he couldn't bear to meet my gaze. We sat down in the living room, the silence between us hanging like a thick fog. I could feel the coldness of the moment creeping in, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Jason, for the first time in years, seemed fragile, his usual stoic self replaced by something more vulnerable, more real. It was a side of him I hadn't seen in a long time, if ever. I should have told you this sooner," he said, breaking the silence, "but I didn't know how, and I don't even know where to start." His voice cracked a little, and it felt like I could hear the weight of years of silence in those words. My chest tightened, a rush of emotions flooding through me, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I was ready to hear what he was about to say. "I didn't leave because I was angry," he continued, his voice growing softer. "I left because of something that happened, something Dad did, and I can't keep pretending that it didn't happen anymore." I sat there, trying to wrap my head around his words. The Jason I knew would never speak like this, never open up in this way. He had always kept his emotions at a distance, locked behind that wall he'd built as a kid. But now, it was as if that wall had come crashing down, and in its place all that remained was the raw truth of his pain. My mind raced, and I couldn't help but think back to the last time we had really spoken, before things started to fall apart between us. It was years ago, after that fight, the one that changed everything. I'd tried to be there for him, to reach out, but after that day, it seemed like he pulled away completely, and I, in turn, had backed off, unsure of how to fix things that felt too broken to repair. I told myself it was just a phase, that he was growing up dealing with his own stuff, but sitting here now, hearing him speak in a way I never thought possible, I realized that I hadn't truly understood what had been happening beneath the surface. Jason's voice brought me back to the present. I don't even know if I can forgive him for what he did, but I can't keep carrying this alone anymore, and I couldn't go to anyone else. You're the only one who might understand. I blinked, trying to process the weight of his confession. This wasn't just a typical family argument. This wasn't just about the usual father-son conflict. No, what Jason was talking about was something far more serious, something that I had never imagined. I felt the flood of memories hit me, the long nights spent trying to connect with Jason when he was younger, the hours I'd spent talking to him when he seemed so distant. I remembered the pain in my own marriage, the cracks I had ignored, thinking they would heal on their own. And now, here was Jason, telling me that it wasn't just about father-son tensions, that there was more to the story, a hidden truth I had never suspected. I wanted to say something, to tell him everything would be okay, but the words wouldn't come. It felt like we were both trapped in this moment, suspended in time, unsure of what would come next. Jason shifted in his seat, his hands wringing together. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, not yet. I don't even know if I can forgive myself, but I just need you to know. The words hung in the air, unfinished, and I could feel the tension building. I knew I needed to hear the rest of the story, but part of me feared what would come after. Jason paused, his hand trembling slightly as he finally looked up at me. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel the weight of every second stretching out before us, each breath heavier than the last. His eyes locked onto mine, the tension in his face unmistakable. For a moment, it seemed like he was struggling to find the right words, like he knew what he was about to say would change everything. Finally, he took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort, and then he spoke. Do you remember that fight we had? I've never forgiven myself for what happened after that, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just about the argument. There was something much bigger I was hiding from you and Dad. Something that's been haunting me for years. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I felt the blood drain from my face, and for a second, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. What was he talking about? What could possibly be bigger than the argument that had torn us apart all those years ago? Jason's gaze softened, as if he was preparing to share something so personal, so devastating that the mere act of saying it out loud would make it all too real. He seemed to shrink back, almost as if he feared the weight of his confession would crush him. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't just a passing guilt or a trivial mistake he was carrying. This was something deep, something that had festered inside him for far too long. I could barely breathe, the air too thick to inhale properly. Jason, I managed to croak, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "What are you talking about? What happened?" His eyes flickered with pain, and I could see him hesitate, as if even speaking the words would make them too undeniable. But he didn't pull away. He took another breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with regret. "It happened when I was younger," he started, his words slow and measured, as though he was testing them in his mind before letting them spill out. "It wasn't just about what you think. It wasn't just about me being angry or distant or whatever. There was something else, something I did, something I've carried with me all this time." My head was spinning. I tried to follow his words, but they were slippery, as if they didn't quite fit together. Jason, my stepson, the quiet boy I'd tried so hard to understand, was talking about something I couldn't grasp. The pieces didn't fit. I searched his face for any sign that this was some cruel joke, a misstep in a conversation that had gone too far. But there was nothing. He looked broken. There was nothing but truth in his eyes, and it scared me. "Jason, what did you do?" I finally whispered, the question hanging like a thread in the heavy silence. His eyes shifted away, and for a moment I thought he might retreat into himself again, but he didn't. Instead, he took a shaky breath and continued. "I was a kid. I didn't know what I was doing," he said, his voice cracking. "But I was involved in something that wasn't just between me and Dad. There was another person, another family member, and I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know what it meant, and I ran from it. I ran from everything, and I thought if I pretended it didn't happen, it would go away." I felt like I was drowning in his words. There was a sinking feeling in my stomach, a pressure building in my chest that made it hard to think, hard to process. Jason had always been distant, but now it was like I was hearing him for the first time, really hearing him. "What are you saying?" I could barely whisper. "Who else was involved?" Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze falling to the floor. "It was my uncle," he said, almost too quietly for me to hear. "I was just a kid. I never wanted it to happen, but I was caught up in something I didn't understand, and I was just a kid. I never wanted it to happen, but I was caught up in something I didn't understand, and A rush of confusion, disbelief, and anger flooded me all at once. I couldn't process it. My mind raced, trying to piece together what he was telling me. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but I couldn't. It felt like the ground beneath us was crumbling away. This was too much. I can't believe this," I stammered, my breath quickening. "You're telling me this happened and you didn't tell us? You didn't tell me? Why? Why would you hide something like this?" Jason was shaking his head now, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. I didn't know how to say it. I didn't want to ruin everything. But the guilt has been eating me alive for years. I thought I could move on, but it never stopped. It just kept getting worse. I didn't want to hurt anyone else. I could see the torment in his eyes, the same torment that had held him in silence for so long. It was like a weight I couldn't even imagine, one he had been carrying alone for far too long. But that didn't make it easier for me to understand. My thoughts were a jumble, a million questions fighting for attention, each one more urgent than the last. Jason? I said, my voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and concern. This changes everything. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Why didn't you tell your dad? His face crumpled and his shoulders slumped as if the very question had broken him. I thought it would destroy us. I thought if I told Dad, he would never look at me the same. And I couldn't bear it, so I kept it inside. The silence that followed his words felt suffocating, like I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that he was just a kid, that there was no way he could have understood what was happening at the time. But the other part of me, the part that knew the weight of what had just been revealed, couldn't let go of the fear that this was just the beginning of something much more complicated. The room felt colder, and the tension between us was palpable. I didn't know how to hold him up through this, how to make sense of what he had just told me. The truth was too much to bear, and yet I couldn't walk away from it. I couldn't turn my back on him now. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity as Jason stood there, his eyes filled with desperation. The air between us was thick, heavy with the weight of everything he had just confessed. He shifted his stance, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, as if he were trying to gather enough courage to speak, to ask for something that seemed impossible. I don't know what to do. I'm lost, Jason said, his voice barely audible now. The tremor in his voice was unmistakable, a rawness that I hadn't heard from him before. Can you help me? The question hit me like a slap in the face. Help him? How could I help him? I felt paralyzed, as if the weight of the world had suddenly been placed squarely on my shoulders. In that moment, I couldn't breathe. My thoughts collided with each other, and the gravity of what he was asking overwhelmed me. My family, my marriage, Jason's future, everything seemed to hang in the balance, and all of it rested on one decision, one answer. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My throat felt dry, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. He was asking me to make a choice that I wasn't sure I was ready for. Could I stand by him after everything he had just revealed? Could I still be the stepmother he needed, the person he could turn to for support? For the first time in a long while, I realized I didn't know him the way I thought I did. I'd always tried to understand him, to bridge the gap between us, but I hadn't seen what was hidden beneath the surface. And now, with this confession, I was faced with a decision that felt impossible. My mind raced, but there was no answer, no clear path forward. I thought of my husband, of how this revelation would shatter him, how it would tear apart the fragile peace we'd built. And then, there was Jason, lost, broken, reaching out to me, asking for help. But was I strong enough to carry this burden? Could I offer him the support he so desperately needed without completely unraveling myself? Jason's eyes were filled with uncertainty now, as if he knew the weight of his confession had thrown everything into chaos. His shoulders slumped, and I saw how fragile he truly was. He was a young man, just starting to understand the complexity of the world around him, yet he was carrying a secret that no one should ever have to bear. I don't know what to do, he repeated, his voice soft and full of anguish. I thought if I kept it buried, it would go away, but it never does. It's just getting worse. I stood frozen, unable to speak, my mind still reeling from everything he had just shared. Jason turned slowly, his footsteps quiet as he moved toward the door. The tension in the room was suffocating. As he opened it and stepped into the hallway, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his departure. The silence in the bathroom was deafening. I stood there, staring at the door he had just walked through, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just about Jason anymore. It was about me, my family, my choices. Could I really help him? Could I be the one to guide him through this dark and complicated time? As I stood there, in the aftermath of his confession, my mind kept circling back to one thing. What did he need from me? He had asked for help, but was that really what he needed? Or was he searching for something deeper? Something that I wasn't sure I could offer? I had always prided myself on being strong, on being the one who could handle difficult situations. But this was different. This was beyond my control, beyond anything I had ever imagined. And in that moment, I realized how little I truly knew about Jason, about his past, about the person he had become. The boy I had tried to understand for years was no longer the same. The silence wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. I wanted to follow him, to pull him back and tell him everything would be okay. But deep down, I knew that this was something we would both have to navigate on our own. He had made his choice by speaking up, and now I had to decide if I was willing to walk with him through the consequences. I took a deep breath, my hand resting on the sink as I tried to steady myself. What was I supposed to do now? How could I process everything I had just learned and still move forward? My thoughts were clouded, and the future felt uncertain. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. As I turned away from the bathroom door, I could hear the faint sound of Jason's footsteps retreating down the hallway. His pain, his guilt, his fear, it all seemed so tangible now. I couldn't help but wonder if, in that moment, I had made the right choice. But as the silence enveloped me, I realized that the hardest part wasn't deciding whether or not to help him. It was accepting that sometimes the most difficult choices are the ones that don't come with clear answers. Would I be able to help Jason heal, or would I watch him slip further into the darkness? Only time would tell, but for now, all I could do was stand there, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me, unsure of what would come next. The silence in the bathroom was suffocating. I stood there, feeling the weight of Jason's words heavy in my chest, like a burden I wasn't sure I could carry. As the door clicked shut behind him, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. What had I just learned? What was I supposed to do with the secret he had entrusted to me? And more importantly, what did this mean for our family? For the longest time, I thought I understood Jason. I thought I knew where he was coming from, what was driving him. But now, standing there in that empty bathroom, I couldn't help but feel like I had missed something crucial. Was I really as close to him as I thought? Had I truly seen the pain he had been carrying all these years? I couldn't help but think about the weight of the choice that lay before me. The question Jason had asked still lingered in my mind. Could I help him? Could I really take on this responsibility, knowing how much it could change everything? I'll never forget the way his voice trembled when he spoke, the desperation, the fear. It was all so raw. He had come to me, a person he barely opened up to, asking for help. Was it my place to offer it? Should I even try, knowing how much was at stake? The guilt, the uncertainty, the fear of losing everything. It all made me question my own ability to make the right decision. I stood there, frozen in that moment, wondering what the right thing was. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you stand by your family even when the road ahead seemed too dark to navigate? Would you reach out, offering support even when you don't have all the answers? As the minutes passed, I realized that there's no clear answer. It's easy to say, we would always do the right thing, but when it's your family on the line, when it's someone you love who is asking for help, it's never that simple. Would I help Jason? Would I do what was necessary to help him face whatever he was hiding, even if it meant confronting my own worst fears? Or would I walk away knowing that sometimes the hardest thing to do is nothing at all? The choice in the end is never easy. Now I turn to you. What would you do if you found yourself in this situation, faced with this same painful decision? What would your answer be? Would you stay and try to help, or would you walk away unable to take on the weight of someone else's past? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts with us. I'd love to hear what you think. This is a conversation we need to have, because sometimes the hardest part isn't knowing what's right. It's having the courage to act when everything feels uncertain. And if you've found yourself moved by this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We're here to share more real-life stories that make us reflect on the choices we make, the people we love, and the lives we touch. We hope to hear from you soon. Family secrets can carry a weight that's hard to put into words. They sit quietly, hidden in the corners of our lives, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. When they finally do, it's like everything shifts, like the ground beneath you becomes unstable. There's no simple answer when confronted with the past, no easy way to move forward. All you can do is face it head on. But even then, you're left wondering if you made the right choice, if you did enough. The truth is, the path to healing isn't a straight line. It's messy, full of uncertainty, and often more painful than we anticipate. But it's a journey we all must walk in one form or another. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to keep moving forward, even when you're not sure what the next step is. Thank you for watching today's story. We know it wasn't an easy one, but we hope it made you reflect on the complexity of family, the weight of secrets, and the choices we all must face. If this story resonated with you, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'll be back soon with more stories that dive into the heart of what it means to be human. See you next time.